Okay, so tonight's Science Pub Talk is entitled Water Management in the Southern Willamette Valley and Mid-Coast. And that's presented by Lanaya Blakely, and she will cover Oregon water law and how the state manages water use in Southern Willamette Valley and the Mid-Coast, and include information about irrigation, wells, ponds, exempt uses, in-stream water rights, regulation, and enforcement. And Ms. Blakely has served as the District 2 Watermaster since July of 2017, and she filled the shoes of Michael Mattick, who retired after 18 years in that position. And her education and work experience focuses on natural resources, environmental monitoring, and fisheries research. And in her free time, she enjoys hiking and camping, going out with her husband and dogs. So thank you very much, and with that, we will welcome Lanaya.
Thank you, Maggie. Such a good crowd. I'm very happy to be here. Some of the questions in the trivia will be answered or included in the presentation, but if you have any questions about the answers, I'm happy to take those at the end. And we can have a Q&A at the end if you'd like that, or if there's something you're dying to know when we're on a particular slide, please just raise your hand and I'll try to address that. So just a quick overview. I'm going to try to cover a lot of information at a high level. We'll talk about District 2, the area that I regulate, Oregon water law, exempt uses, well basics, some of the groundwater issues in this district, options to obtain new water rights. We'll talk just briefly about the Willamette Basin reservoirs that are operated by the Army Corps of Engineers, and what kind of information that you should know about your property or water use on your property. So when we're talking about managing water, I am going to be presenting just from the perspective of the Oregon Water Resources Department, which is responsible for the allocation or the use of water. But there are several agencies that also have a vested interest in regulating water use. What many of you are probably familiar with is water quality, with what the Watershed Council works on. The Oregon Health Authority is responsible for groundwater drinking program. DEQ and Department of Agriculture has vested interest in confined animal feeding and the marijuana industry. And if I appear out of breath, I am, because I am 9.5 months pregnant, so I'll try to not get too excited, and I won't put on a show for you guys, hopefully. Any type of modification of wetlands or waterways, you'll need a removal fill permit from Department of State Lands. And then managing stormwater and property disputes all fall under the civil law. And so you can see that there's a lot of people who have interest in water that I can't answer for you, but I can point you in the right direction. But today we're just talking about the use and allocation of water. So Water Resources Department has 21 Watermasters across the state, 21 Watermaster districts separate, identified up here. I am the Watermaster for District 2, which is the southernmost district in the Northwest region. I am responsible for regulating water use, distributing water during times of shortage, either due to an in-stream right not being satisfied or a senior user not receiving their entitled amount of water. I enforce water code. I do outreach events, do a little bit of everything, measuring wells, inspecting dams. Keeps me pretty busy. So there's 8 major rivers that I monitor, as well as their tributaries. The district itself is almost 6,400 square miles. I'm the only person in my office, so if you haven't seen me or you've never heard of the Watermaster, it's just a big area for one person to cover. It includes the majority of Lynn and Lane counties, and then small portions of Benton and Douglas County. There's over 7,500 water rights in the area, and almost 5,400 of them are subject to seasonal regulation. So you can think of irrigation water rights are limited to the growing season, usually March through October, and so those requires some extra attention. There are 48 in-stream water rights that are regulated for. So those are water rights that Fish and Wildlife, or DEQ, have applied for fish to protect fish habitat or to abate pollution. So I actively monitor those, and then when those stream flows aren't met, then I go out and start shutting people off. But we'll talk more about that in a second. There's over 44,000 wells that we have registered, and there's probably thousands more than that have existed prior to the groundwater law that we don't have enumerated. And then I inspect 32 dams a year, depending on what type of safety requirements they require. So did everyone get this question right about prior appropriation doctrine? Is the couple of them? Great. So Oregon water law came into effect in 1909, so it's been around for a little while. And what it basically means that if you started using water in 1910, you're the first person out there, you're entitled to that water for the specific use that you were using. If someone came along in 1970 and started using water, you might think, oh, that's great, I finally have a neighbor after all this time. But then come summer, you may realize that stream flow is so low that you're not getting your historical amount of water that you were entitled to. So you'd call me and say, hey, Lanaya, I need you to try to get some more water in the stream. And I'll say, well, I don't have a rain dance, so I haven't perfected that yet. But I will go out and I will do a stream flow measurement to validate your claim that there's not enough water in the stream. Sometimes it's just they need to extend the pipe for their pump a little farther, and then there's plenty of water for the senior user. But sometimes it may be that there really is not enough flow there. So the first thing I'll do is identify any illegal use on that source upstream, regulate those off. If I can't find any, then I'll begin to shut off junior users upstream. In this very simple example, it would just be the 1970 right would be shut off, or their rate would be reduced until the senior user got what they were entitled to. So that's kind of the basics. First in time, first in right. So when we're talking about water law, there's about 7 components that we're always referring to, or this is something you should have in your head when you start thinking about water. You want to know, like, well, what's the source? Is it groundwater? Is it collected below land surface? Or is it surface water? Any water that's on the surface of the ground is considered surface water. What is the type of use for this? Is it domestic? Is it industrial use? What are you going to be using this water? What is it intended to be used for? The priority date goes straight back to the prior appropriation, and that's the date that you started using water. That's the date that, if you have to be regulated off, that's your spot in line. And that applies both to permits and exempt uses, which we'll talk a little bit more in a second. Number 4, so point of diversion appropriation. Diversion is from surface water. Appropriation is a well. So what is the specific location where you are taking that water from the source? Where is that water being applied to? So is it on a set number of acres for the footprint of irrigation of a field? Or if it's municipal, it might say the municipal boundary, the urban growth boundary of Cottage Grove, for example. And then, has this water right been used? Water has to be used at least once every 5 years, or it could become subject to forfeiture, cancellation. So it's up to you to keep track of that. We can talk more about that if there are questions at the end about forfeiture. And then there's always terms and conditions with water use. It could be limited to a volume, or to a rate, or to a season of use. So these are the 7 components whenever you're thinking about water that you hopefully you'll start automatically thinking about these parts. So water in Oregon is, you can think of it, it's a public resource. It's held in trust by the state. The Water Resources Department is responsible to assure that there's sufficient and sustainable supply to meet current and future needs. So one way we do that is by monitoring who is using what kind of water through the permit process. There are also, excuse me. There's also exempt uses which have limitations, but this is just one way we can monitor natural stream flow and then subtract out all of these consumptive uses. So we have a better idea of what's existing in the system minus what uses are already allocated. I get a lot of questions of whether there's such a thing as a grandfathered water right, and my boss says only the rights that your granddaddy applied for. So prior to 1909, there were people here using water. Up until the 90s, they had the opportunity to file what we call a claim that said, you know, back in 1858, I started using water to irrigate 20 acres. They filed those claims with the department, and they'll go through an adjudication process. The department makes a determination, sends that to the circuit court. They evaluate the department's determination, and then will issue or may not issue final certificates in the form of a decree. So so 1909 was the cutoff for surface water, and then the groundwater registrations are the same thing, but water coming from wells. But the Groundwater Act didn't start until 1955. So these are all the areas across the state that have been adjudicated. So there are these really old water uses that have gone through this process, and the decrees have been issued and certificates have been given. Certificates are the permanent water right. So as you can see, the majority of Lane County has not been adjudicated. So there are several of these very old groundwater and surface water rights out there. This is just one type of authorization that the department uses to manage water. Some of you may be familiar with the issues going on in the Klamath Basin, and that is related to this process through the adjudication process. Any questions about this immediate topic? The question is, why is Lane County so white or not filled in? Adjudication processes take a very long time. And it takes a lot of resources. And so the Klamath adjudication has taken up most of the department's resources as of late because there's so many interest groups. The state, the feds, and the tribes are all trying to work together. You know how well that goes. So it's just not enough resources to keep moving forward because it's an evaluation of entire stream bases that take time. So to date, only one groundwater basin has been adjudicated, or one claim, and that's because it was one well on the south coast. They thought they'd get that one out of the way. I don't anticipate groundwater being adjudicated in my lifetime, if that gives you an idea of how slow these things go. Excellent question, thank you. Okay, so other authorizations, the primary authorization today, if you want to use water, is going to be the permit process, where you will file an application, the department will evaluate it for injury. So is your use going to affect existing uses? And is there water available to at least 80% of the time to meet your request? So there's several stages from application until you get to your permit, where there's opportunity for the public to make comment and for a protest to occur. Protests it's directly related to the department's determination and our findings, so it's fairly rare. And these water use cannot occur under these permits until the permit is actually issued. So some people, get really excited. I'm going to get my permit in there and I'm going to get it back really fast. Well, it's probably going to take 12, 18 months for a groundwater right, 6 months for a pond water right. And then, so until that permit is issued, you won't be able to use it. Submitted your application, it's approved, you get your permit. You have 5 years to prove up or to make beneficial use. So that means you're using all of the water that you requested for the given use on the place of use and complied with all of the terms and conditions. After that 5-year period, or sooner, if you're on the ball getting your project done, you have to hire a certified water right examiner to issue or to do a survey of your property and submit what we call a claim of beneficial use. And it would say, yes, Mr. Smith used all or a portion of the water he requested in his permit. That gets sent to Salem, they do an evaluation, and then they issue the certificate. The certificate is the permanent water right that gets stuck to your property. So if you sell your property, your water right goes with it, or if you subdivide it, then it gets split, and we'll talk about how that changes ownership. The only way that you can change it is if you go through the formal transfer process. You can change the footprint of the water right. You could add a well location or move your pump. Or if you don't use it, it could become subject to cancellation. Yes. Is there a disadvantage to being efficient? No. Are you referring to is if you use drip and you're able to just stretch your water farther? Mm-hmm. As far as forfeiture, no. But what I would encourage you to do, if that's the case and you have a very drip or some type of very efficient system, you can go through what's called our allocation of conserved water program. And if you do an on-farm improvement, say you go from a wheel line or a big gun to drip or some other very efficient means of irrigation, then we have a coordinator who can help you calculate how much water you're saving. 25% of that conserved water that you're not using goes to the state as an instream right to protect fish and wildlife. And then the remainder of that you can keep and apply on new lands at a reduced rate. So it's one of our best programs to help stretch water farther. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. All right. So have any of you ever looked at a water right before or spent time pondering what it means? Okay, we're gonna walk through one real quick. This is a water right certificate. It's for a well. It's always gonna specify what basin it's in. That's how we categorize all water use. It's always gonna tell you what the use is. In this case, that's irrigation for 20 acres. And it's gonna tell you the max rate that you can divert if you're irrigating all acres. In this case, it's 0.12 cubic feet per second. If you divide that by the acres that are authorized, that's going to give you your rate per acre. So if you're irrigating something less, like 5, you just multiply that by 5 to get the maximum rate that you could divert from the source. There's also volume limitations. So we're going to have rate and volume, so you can't turn your sprinklers on and leave them on 24/7 in most cases. There's a standard of 2.5 acre feet per acre. So you can think of an acre square, 1 foot or 2.5 feet high, and that's the volume that you would get for the irrigation season. The period of use for this water right is June 15th through October 31st. Older water rights do not include the season of use. So just call me and I'll tell you what it is. Most season of uses are March 1 through October 31 for irrigation. So we can know immediately that for some reason this is restricted to a shorter period. Priority date is May 25th, 2000. So if there is a shortage of groundwater and we can demonstrate that this well is immediately impacting whoever is being injured, then we would regulate back in the aquifer, to this date. Well location is going to be specified by township range and section and have a measured distance from a land survey corner. And it's going to denote a very specific footprint also by TRS where that water can be applied. And that's identified in the final proof survey map. And so you can see the hatchered area is where the only place that you can use that water without going through the transfer process to modify it. And then it has the specific well location that can be used for this right. So any modification or deviation from this must go through the transfer process. So on page 2, we have a list of conditions for use. And the point really isn't to be able to read it. I know it's very small text, but totalizing flow meter is almost required on all groundwater and surface water permits these days. reporting annual water use, so you'd just record every month and turn it in at the end of the year. Or doing a pump test every 10 years. These are also very common conditions that you'll see in groundwater permits. And it's very important that you read the document that you have, because it may have something very unique and specific to your well and your situation. In this case, the reason the season was shortened to June through October is because there's hydraulic connection between an unnamed stream tributary to Amazon Creek. So to make sure that you weren't impacting that use, they restricted the season. The last thing to look for when you're looking at conditions is the may or shall language. If it says shall, you got to do it. If it says may, the department may tell you in the future to do it. Okay, any questions about permitting? There's a lot of information, kind of fast. Okay. So there are exempt uses for both groundwater and surface water that I'll go through real quick. And you may have noticed in the trivia, exempt uses are those that are exempt from the permit process. So you don't have to go through the process we just described. They're kind of pre-approved. It's a very short list for surface water. The most common one that people use is for livestock watering. If you're going to divert water from surface water for your livestock to drink, it has to be on a tank with a valve. You can't just dig a ditch from the river down your property for the cows to drink from. And then rainwater collection is probably the most common one that we do around here. There's lots of properties that can't get water rights for maybe several different reasons. But if you capture rainwater off of an artificial impervious surface, like a roof and your downspouts, then you capture that water in a tank, then you can use that water for any use that you'd like. And then we won't require you to get a permit before putting out your fire from the river in your backyard. So go ahead and feel free to do that. But back to rainwater, because people always ask me if they can put it in a pond. You can put your rainwater in a pond without a permit only if your pond is bermed all the way around, so we're not getting any surface water runoff into it, and if it's lined with an impenetrable barrier. That way we're not having groundwater coming up and we're not having any surface water going in there. So we know that what's in there is what you've captured off of an artificial impervious surface. Yes, ma'am. The question was if that's what you wanted, if you want to draw from it. No. If you want to impound water, rainwater, this is the only way that you could do it in a pond without going through the permit process, is berming it and lining it. Okay, and exempt uses of groundwater are most commonly used exemptions if you live in the rural area or small towns that don't have a municipal water service. You are probably using your well for domestic use and hopefully no more than a half acre of non-commercial garden and lawn. So the domestic use is limited to 15,000 gallons a day. It's so high because you can have as many households on one well as you desire. Although once you get to 4 or more, the Oregon Health Authority requires water quality testing. And then commercial use allows 5,000 gallons per day. It does not include irrigation of any kind. So let's say you grow apples in your backyard and you want to wash your apples so that you can sell them. The washing of the apples counts as the 5,000 gallons. Yes, ma'am. The question is if you can have a well within a municipality, and the answer is yes. So cities mandate that you connect to their water system, but as far as water resources is concerned and well construction standards as whatnot, we don't have any restriction with drilling a well inside a boundary, city boundary. But the city may prevent you from hooking your house up domestically to it, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Okay. And then livestock watering also can come from your well, and there's no limit to volume or head of livestock that you can water from your well. So one of the big questions I get is, if I put more wells on my property, does that get me more exempt water? And the answer is no. Water use for the exempt uses are limited to systems or contiguous properties. So in this example, property A has 2 wells, but they're still limited to that ½ acre of irrigation and that 15,000 gallons per day for domestic use. If you have multiple properties that are sharing one well, you have to split that exemption. How you do it is up to you. It doesn't have to be equal, but it would be 5,000 gallons per day for the domestic portion, and then you would have to split the irrigation acreage. So it ends up not being very much irrigation. And then in this situation, absent some type of legal easement, well owner B or property B would actually be the owner of the well. Okay, so I'll just do a quick exercise so we can try to figure out, like, well, when do I need a water right? When there's so many exemptions that I might qualify for. So our first question, like when we were talking about groundwater components, what is the source? So groundwater, below land, surface water, above land. What will the water be used for? Domestic use, so cooking, sanitation, washing your car. If you're going to exceed the 15,000 gallons per day, then you're going to need a water right through the water right permit process. If you're not, feel free to go ahead and tap that well and use it for your home. Irrigation, so irrigating to promote plant growth. The first question is, are you going to sell those crops? It doesn't matter what size area you're irrigating or how much water you're using. If those plants that you're growing are going to be sold, you're going to be compensated in any way, it requires a water right. So if they're sold, yes, you need a permit. If no, the next question is, are you going to exceed that ½ acre? If not, then you can use your well. Or if you have a large lawn, like most people in the rural area does, there's a good chance you'll need a water right. Commercial use, so like we talked about, washing those apples. If you're going to exceed 5,000 gallons per day, you need a water right. If not, the next question is, does that commercial use include promoting plant growth? If no, you can use your exempt groundwater. If yes, then you need a permit. And when you're using water under groundwater exemptions, you can't, for example, wash your apples, save that water, and then apply it to irrigation. It can only be used for that original intended use. So livestock. You can use groundwater or surface water for livestock. If you're using surface water, again, you're going to need some type of valve so you aren't continuously taking water out of the surface water source. Fire protection. You can go ahead and use your well to put out a fire if your pump will produce enough. But then your first question is going to be, are you going to be taking it out of a pond? And if so, is the pond permitted? If no, you need a water right for the pond. If yes, you can go ahead and use that pond water, without a secondary permit for fire protection. A lot of places in the rural area, developers will require that you build a pond or have some type of water storage to put out a fire, but those still require a permit in order to do that. Any questions related to this? There seems to be a lot of interest. Yes, ma'am. That's, the question was how much of the state's water is used for cattle from an exempt source, and that's an excellent question. So exempt uses require no notification to the department. Correct. We do not know. Yes. Any other questions? Exempt uses. Yes, ma'am. So groundwater is any water collected below land surface. So if you go out to a park with a shovel and dig a foot-deep hole, the water that's in that hole is groundwater. Surface water is any surface water, any water on land surface. So closer you are to the river, probably the higher the water table is. That's still groundwater when you dig down below land surface. So like a spring, for example, is considered surface water because it is where groundwater meets the surface, and then it becomes on the land surface. It could seep down later at another location, go back underneath, but where it comes to land surface that would be the cutoff point between it being groundwater and surface water. No, not necessarily. So if to drill a well or to dig a dug well, which has very specific construction standards, only requires that you hire a licensed and bonded well driller, or that you become licensed through the department. There's a process for landowners who want to drill their own wells. But if you're going to use the exempt uses, all you have to do is hire a licensed and bonded well driller, and they'll make sure that the right paperwork is filed, a start card and a well log. So it's the use that matters of when you need a permit and when you don't. The other thing to consider is that a water right does not create an easement. So it doesn't automatically grant you access onto your neighbor's property if that's where the source is. So this is similar to the situation we just had. We had shared wells. In this situation, if there's not some type of legal easement in place, then property owner B owns the well, and out of the goodness of their heart, they let A and C access it. In a similar situation with A and B, oftentimes there's irrigation water rights, that are several miles maybe away from the source, and that requires them to cross several properties to get to their authorized point of diversion. If they don't have access to property A does not have to let them cross, so functionally they could prevent them from using their water right, and it could result in forfeiture or cancellation. So always get along with your neighbors. So you need a legal easement. We do not keep shared well agreements on file, so that's always something if you're looking at purchasing, or you have this situation right now and you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? Hire a lawyer. Let's see. Okay, so we'll go through a couple other examples. So as the rural area is developed, these larger water rights, that are from the 50s and older, are being subdivided. So for example, on the left, we have a 1970 groundwater right for 15 acres. And then over time, it was subdivided from 1 into 3 properties. And so each of the portion of the water right they get is for the footprint that's on their property. So A has 3, B 10, C 2. So like we talked about before, you take your rate per acre and then multiply it by the number of acres that are on your property, and then it's coming from the authorized source. Property B could be sold, and you don't like the new neighbor, they don't like you. You could, if you don't have an easement or something like that, then you would file a transfer application to add a well location onto your property so that you could continue legally irrigating your portion of that water right. And the exact same thing is if it's surface water. It's the same concept. So you would separate it according to acreage for the portion of the water right that you're entitled to. And then you could add a point of diversion. Hopefully it's downstream. Those are the easiest ones to approve. But this is just the basics of how water rights are subdivided over time. Sometimes if you look at our integrated water resource mapping tool online, you'll see these huge irrigation water rights with like 1,000 different tax lots on there from a subdivision that went in. Unfortunately, those developers didn't have the sense to ask that maybe they should move that water right off and then sell it to a farmer down the road. So that's also an option for people if they don't want to lose these water rights. Okay, how are we doing on time? Oh, okay, okay, good. Making good time. So the Groundwater Act was passed in 1955. So there were lots of people here farming and just going about their daily lives before then. And 1955 is when we started requiring well logs be recorded for at least irrigation wells, so wells that are specifically being used for irrigation. These well logs are really important because they describe all of the construction of the well, what the water bearing zones are, how deep it is, if it meets well construction standards, how deep the seals are. So all wells that are registered with the department have one of these on file. And so if you ever need to find one, you can call me and give me your tax lot number, and hopefully I can help you find it. And in 1962 is when we started requiring these for all wells. So as you can imagine, if you have an older developed property, we may not have something on file for you. And then so in 1996, we required well ID tags. And they look like this. They attach to the outside casing, and it's the easiest way to match a well log with a particular well. It's a free program, so if you don't have one of these on your well, please contact me, and I'll point you to our website that has that one-page form that you send to Salem, and they'll send you these tags in the mail. It's just a really easy way to keep track of your well, the location, and to register it with the state, so we can have a better idea about how groundwater is being used. And these tags are actually required when a property is sold if it doesn't actually have one. However, I don't have time to keep track of all the properties that are sold, so no one except hopefully your realtor will tell you about this. And then water quality testing is a requirement at time of sale. And just like the trivia question, it's 100 feet recommended setback between wells. It's a recommendation because some of these lots are just simply not large enough to get that much distance between you and your neighbor's well. But we do require a minimum 50-foot setback between your well and any septic tank, and 100 feet from any drain field to avoid contamination. If you're drilling an exempt well, so these are groundwater used just for exempt groundwater purposes, then they need to be registered with the department. It's a one-time recording fee and form, and that just gets us a better idea of how water is being used. Yes, sir. And a what? Is there a minimum distance between a well and a livestock facility? If it's the like in the confined animal feeding or a sewage lagoon, it would be the 100-foot setback, similar to a drain field, because you have, that sewage. Right, then that just the neighbor's barn wouldn't require a minimum setback. There's a 5-foot minimum setback from a permanent structure, but that's it. You're welcome. Okay, so groundwater restricted areas. The county has identified some type of water limited areas, but they're not recognized by the state. These are administratively recognized groundwater limited areas. Good news for you guys, none of them are around here. The closest one is out in Fork Rock, and then there's some in the Southern Hills, the Salem area. In these areas, it's where the resource has been so depleted that it's been necessary to restrict future uses or not issue any new permits, but still allow exempt uses, you know, like domestic use, or restrict just everything. So the most, I think the only groundwater withdrawn area for no new appropriations is up in Mosier in north central up there on the Columbia. And then there's a little tiny one in Silverton called Victor Point. But not something we really need to worry about down here. But the aquifers in this area are known to be low yielding. So South Eugene in particular is known to have 1 gallon to 6 minute per gallon wells, pretty low yielding. And that's just a characteristic of the type of sediment in this area, the marine sediment and the Western Cascades. The closer you get to the river, the more water there is in those sands and gravels. Out on the coast, we have saltwater intrusion. We have a lot of sand, a lot of gravel out there, but it's just not the desired type of water. Unfortunately, the department is concerned with whether or not there's water there. It's DEQ and EPA, you know, they're responsible for water quality and monitoring those types of things. So if there's water in your well, but it's poor quality, we would say you don't have a water quantity issue. You need to talk to somebody else. Yes, ma'am. The question is if the Riverbend Hospital impacted the water quality? Oh, the groundwater level. I have no idea. I'm not sure. I will talk about, this is an image, a map produced by Layton County of groundwater quality issues. So it's kind of hard to read, but we have natural arsenic in the south through here. We have iron and sulfur out on the coast. And then the Junction City Coburg area is actually a Guama area, so DEQ monitors that for nitrates due to agriculture activities and residential activities. So just a brief description of groundwater quality issues in this area. Okay. So if you want a new water right, there's a few options you can pursue. Groundwater permit being the most likely to be approved, because most surface water in this area and across the state has already been fully allocated, so there's not enough water available for new uses, or there's lots of water available, but a basin plan has been adopted that restricts the types of uses that can be approved. So the McKenzie River is an example of this. So McKenzie, you can float it year round. There's always water there. The basin plan says there will no longer be allocations for like irrigation, for example, out of the river. And that was just one way that the Water Resource Commission and the legislature kind of got ahead of the ball to say, oh, we need to save this water while it's still liquid and not just on paper, so that it can be protected and saved for those resources. One of the most common surface water authorizations you can get is to use stored water. So this is, we're taking this back to the ponds. So if you want a pond, you need a storage right. And what you're asking the department is to store that water when water is plentiful, usually November through May or June, depending where you are. And then you need a secondary right to take the water out of the pond if you want to use that for an out of reservoir use. If you just want to leave it there for fire protection or aesthetics or wildlife, you can do that. You don't need that secondary right. It's just if you want to use the water out of the pond. So ponds can be either just holes in the ground, or they can be more complex structures, you know, with a berm and an outlet pipe. And if it meets certain criteria that it won't trigger dam safety evaluations, you can go through an expedited process, and it can take about 6 months to get this approved, which is our fastest. These secondary rights can be for all kinds of uses, not just irrigation. It could be industrial or domestic or nursery use. And then the third option for the secondary right, you know, to use that stored water is to get a contract with the Bureau of Reclamation. So most of you are probably pretty familiar with all of the large reservoirs that the Army Corps operates in the south. So look at Point, Hills Creek, Cougar. All of these are operated by the Corps for flood control, and exclusively for flood control. So they're supposed to be able to handle a 100-year flood event. And so they have a rule curve that dictates how much water they store and when they release it. So that water that they store, when it's time to release it, you can request a contract if you have access to the main stem of the Willamette or the McKenzie or the Coast Fork. To pick up that water downstream. So they'll kind of earmark some of that released water for your use. So that contract, sometimes they're 40-year contracts. They have an annual fee associated with them, but sometimes that's the only opportunity to get surface water, especially if you're that close to the river where a groundwater application would be denied because it would have too much impact to the surface water. The water that's stored there is only characterized for irrigation and recreation use. So that stored water isn't feeding any municipalities. It's not feeding any other uses. So it's earmarked for irrigation and recreation. So there is this study going on to try to change the characterization of that stored water so that municipalities could use it as a redundant source and to better prepare for the future needs. So if you want more information about that, there's a link here. It's on our website, or you can contact me directly and I can put you in touch with that program. There's a lot of text here, and I think we're getting kind of close, but just some key points. If you own rural property and you're using water on your property, things to think about. Do you have legal access to where you divert your water? Does the well meet construction standards? So take a look at your well log. If it's Greek to you, give me a call and I can help explain it to you. Has the water right been used within the last 5 years? We have an evidence of use affidavit, a form on our website that has a whole list of what's considered supporting documentation to support, this use. So you can take a look at that and then keep a record just for your own record, or if you're planning on selling your property, that's probably a question you'll get. Did you have a question? When you say the neighbor's taken over, what do you mean? Mm. Oh. So the question was an inherited property, and the person who inherited it wasn't aware of water law requirements and subject to non-use. Well, if it's a pond, the good news is, and it has a water right, hopefully let's say it's permitted, then its existence of holding water is enough. There's water in it. You're storing water. That's what your water right is for, so that's fine. But as far as the pond being on a property boundary, that would be a civil matter, and so you would need to pursue that either with a lawyer. Yeah, probably best option. Thank you for that question. So do you have authorization to modify a water right or permit? So are you the landowner? If it's a permit, You need to make sure the department knows that you're the one who owns the property now, and you need to do an assignment. Because at the permit phase, unlike the certificate, it's considered a personal right instead of a property right. So until it goes through the complete process, you need to make sure that it's in your name so that you can modify it and prove up and finalize to the certificate program. Have all the terms and conditions been met? This is especially true if you're buying a property or you have a property with a permit. If you're buying it and they say, oh yeah, everything's good, but you were required to install a fish screen, for example, and you know they've been irrigating, we call that a fatal flaw, and your permit will be denied because there's no way of going back to prevent that injury. Or if it has a certain date to drill your well, you need to make sure that the well is actually drilled by that date, or you may need an extension of time, which is $575. So it's just have these things. Am I using the water? Am I complying with the conditions? Is water use being reported if that's a shall statement in your conditions? And then the last one that's important for water resources is always ask if you're buying a property, or try to keep in mind, is this water ever regulated for the in-stream water right? And that'll give you an idea of really what it's worth for that use. For example, there are water rights on the Calapooya that I regulate every year in very early August. And the ground is so wet there that they're being regulated off at the time that they would start needing that water. So they're kind of useless because they're being regulated so early. So just other questions of what might affect the use of this water and the value of the water right. That's the evidence of, this is the list of supporting documentation that you've been using the water, the assignment form, and then any type of water quality concerns need to be addressed to the Oregon Health Authority. If you want me to help you with anything, please contact me. If you have your tax lot number and your address, that's really all I need, and I can help you find information. Send it to me by email or leave me a voice message. If I can't get back to you, then contact the customer service office in Salem. Depending on the size of your request, they might charge you $25. But if it's the dead of summer, it can take me 2 weeks or more to get back to you. I will be going on maternity leave, but we will have support in the office 2 days a week, so your questions should get answered timely. There are a couple of these water right books. There wasn't enough for everyone, but they're available electronically on our website. So if you can't find it on the website, give me a call and I'll email it to you. Any questions? Oh. Yes, ma'am. No, prior to 1955, we didn't have any way to document or keep track of where these wells were. And oftentimes, if a well stopped producing, and depending on the pipe they use, in certain areas you could take a 1.5 to 2 inch pipe and jam it into the ground, and surface water will come flowing out. A lot of people in West Eugene do that. That does not meet proper well construction, so please don't. But they'll just rip the pipe or the casing out of the ground or bend it over and bury it. Please don't do that. Hire a licensed and bonded well driller, and then they'll make sure it's properly abandoned to prevent any groundwater contamination. So chances are, if you can't find it, they probably buried it. Probably because it wasn't producing. That seems the only reason to get rid of a perfectly good well. Any other questions? It was either thoroughly confusing or I just was so good.